Not his birth, not his name, not the legend people love to repeat. This story starts earlier, in a world that was already tired. By the 4th century BCE, power hadn't vanished, it had stalled. Stuck in place, pressing but not moving. No single force could dominate long enough to feel secure. No peace lasted long enough to feel real. Everything survived on temporary control. Treaties everyone expected to break. Borders that shifted quietly. Victories that solved nothing. Later, historians called this the calm before the storm. But it wasn't calm. It was that tension you feel when nothing is exploding yet, but something feels wrong. Like holding your breath without noticing. When balance holds too long without resolution, it doesn't settle. It snaps. Greece wasn't a country, it was an argument. Greek independent city-states pressed together, fiercely proud, deeply divided. Athens talked endlessly about reason, justice, ideals. Sparta didn't talk, it trained, endured, prepared for violence. Thebes rose suddenly and fell just as fast. They shared language, gods, history, but not loyalty. Never loyalty. Once, just once, victory over Persia had united them, and then confidence turned inward. The Peloponnesian War shattered what remained. Athens fell. Sparta ruled briefly, then declined again. Each war promised resolution and delivered only fatigue. By Alexander's time, Greece was alive with ideas, but hollow where it mattered. Freedom mattered more than stability, but autonomy without coordination is fragile. No city could dominate forever. No alliance could be trusted. Every treaty felt temporary. Every victory bred resentment. The Greeks were free and exhausted by it. To the east stood Persia, not weak, not fractured, but overextended. The largest empire the world had ever seen. Roads across continents, armies beyond counting. From the outside, it looked eternal, but magnitude demands maintenance. Governors grew powerful, cultures pulled apart, edges resisted quietly. The empire functioned, but it was holding something too large for too long, and holding creates cracks. Persia remembered Greece, Marathon, Salamis, Plataea, not as losses of power, but losses of certainty. Empires that know their limits hesitate. And north of Greece stood Macedonia, dismissed, underestimated, lacking refinement, lacking prestige, but possessing something the others had lost: momentum. Before Alexander, there was Philip, watching, learning, organizing. He didn't romanticize war, he systematized it. By the time Greece noticed Macedonia, it was already too late. Alexander didn't enter a stable world, he entered a stalled one. Greece couldn't unify, Persia couldn't expand confidently. Macedonia had learned from both. History loves heroes, but heroes rise when conditions allow them. And the ancient world, it was ready. Nothing dramatic happened yet, no omens, no collapse. Just tension that felt normal. Philosophers debated, merchants traded, kings signed treaties they knew would fail. Stability held only because everyone was tired, and tired systems break fast. Alexander didn't create instability, he stepped into it. He didn't invent conquest, he accelerated it. The world wasn't waiting for a hero, it was waiting for disruption. Alexander never experienced a normal childhood, not even for a moment, because there was never a version of life where power felt distant or abstract. From the beginning, authority surrounded him like air, invisible but constant. It lived in the rooms he entered, in the way conversations slowed or shifted when his father appeared, in how grown men straightened their backs without being told. Alexander noticed early that power doesn't need to announce itself. It changes behavior before words are spoken. Laughter softened, jokes disappeared, agreement arrived quickly. No one explained this to him. No one needed to. He learned by watching, by absorbing, by noticing patterns long before he had language for them. Violence wasn't hidden either. It wasn't dramatized, glorified, or framed as heroic necessity. It was discussed plainly, almost casually, as strategy, as consequence, as something inevitable rather than emotional. Cities were punished when they resisted. Enemies were eliminated when they became inconvenient. Mistakes carried costs, and those costs were paid without ceremony. These weren't stories told to frighten a child. They were conversations meant for rulers, spoken openly in front of him because no one thought to shield him. From his father, Philip, Alexander absorbed a hard truth very early. Power was not about ideals, intentions, or moral purity. It was about outcomes. What worked was kept. What failed was discarded without regret. Alexander watched men obey Philip not because they admired him, but because they understood what disobedience meant. That difference mattered more than anyone said out loud. Around Alexander, ambition moved constantly, but rarely loudly. Men competed in silence, for influence, for proximity, for survival. One day someone was trusted, consulted, invited close. The next day they were gone. No explanations, no closure. Alexander learned without instruction that nothing around power is permanent, not loyalty, not safety, not even family bonds. There was no space for innocence to linger. No one ever said, "He's just a child." From early on, Alexander was watched. His reactions were noted, his silences measured, his composure evaluated. Expectation pressed down early, not if he would matter, but how soon. Praise came quickly too, but it never felt light. Compliments carried warning, attention carried pressure. Being noticed was not comfort, it was responsibility. Every glance felt like a test he hadn't agreed to take. Surrounded by kings, generals, violence, and ambition before innocence had time to settle, Alexander didn't lose childhood suddenly or dramatically. It simply never fully formed. In its place grew awareness, restraint, and a quiet understanding that the world he lived in was governed by power, and that one day, sooner than anyone would say aloud, that power would expect something from him in return. Being the son of Philip II was never safety for Alexander. It was exposure from the very beginning. Philip was not simply a king, he was the reason Macedonia existed as a power at all. A man who reshaped a disregarded kingdom through force, reform, and constant forward motion, and Alexander grew up inside that motion, never outside it, never protected from its pressure. From childhood, power was not an abstract idea to him. It was something he watched change people in real time. Voices lowering when Philip entered a room, generals stiffening, nobles recalculating loyalty without speaking. Love in Philip's world was real, but it was never gentle. Affection came tied to expectation. Praise came with the unspoken question of whether it had been earned enough. Alexander learned early that being Philip's son did not secure his future. It only placed him closer to judgment. Philip did not raise him to be comfortable. He raised him to be tested. He gave Alexander responsibility young, command young, visibility young, not as gifts, but as measurements. Each success removed excuses rather than granting rest. Each achievement narrowed Alexander's options, because competence near power is not rewarded with peace, it is rewarded with scrutiny. And admiration, when it sits too close to authority, never stays clean. Alexander admired his father deeply, the discipline, the intelligence, the sheer effectiveness, but admiration curdled easily into rivalry when survival was involved. Philip's many marriages, shifting alliances, and political calculations made succession unstable, and Alexander felt this instability long before anyone explained it to him. He understood instinctively that bloodline was not destiny, momentum was. He watched how loyalty clustered around strength and evaporated around hesitation, how affection mattered less than results, how weakness invited correction. Philip's shadow did not shelter Alexander. It sharpened him, unsettled him, taught him that standing still was dangerous. By the time Alexander reached adulthood, restlessness was already embedded in him, not as ambition alone, but as psychological defense. To hesitate was to invite comparison. To slow down was to give doubt time to grow. Being unknown would have been safer. Being Philip's son meant never being allowed to be small, never being allowed uncertainty, never being allowed the luxury of delay. And when Philip died, violently and without warning, Alexander did not rise into power. He emerged from beneath a shadow that had already taught him the most unforgiving lesson of all. Authority is not inherited calmly. It is seized immediately or contested endlessly. Aristotle did not arrive in Alexander's life like a gentle teacher bringing balance and calm. He arrived like a quiet pressure, subtle at first, almost reasonable, the kind that changes how you see everything without announcing itself. Before Aristotle, Alexander already lived inside power. He had watched men obey his father without question, had seen fear silence rooms, had felt ambition hanging in the air like smoke. But power alone does not create restlessness. Understanding does, and that is what Aristotle gave him. He taught Alexander how the world fit together, how causes led to outcomes, how systems rose and decayed, how nature itself moved toward fulfillment rather than comfort. History stopped being a list of past events and became a pattern still unfolding. Alexander didn't just learn ethics, he learned hierarchy. He didn't just study politics, he learned inevitability. Aristotle spoke of virtue, but not the soft kind. Virtue as excellence, as function fulfilled completely. A knife that cuts poorly fails its purpose. A ruler who hesitates fails his. That idea settled deep. Alexander began to feel that stillness was not peace, that waiting was not wisdom. Homer stopped being poetry and became instruction. Achilles was no longer tragic, he was precise. Short life, complete glory. No half measures. Aristotle never said, "Go conquer," but he explained why greatness mattered more than safety, why meaning outweighed longevity, why humans follow those who seem aligned with purpose rather than comfort. Knowledge did not humble Alexander, it sharpened him. The more he learned about geography, the smaller the world felt. The more he studied politics, the more artificial borders appeared. Greece's endless debates began to sound circular. Persia's massive empire began to look overstretched, vulnerable, waiting. Education didn't calm his mind, it organized his impatience. He learned logic, and logic demanded application. He learned rhetoric, and rhetoric demanded audience. He learned ethics, and ethics demanded action. Restraint became temporary. Patience became strategic. Aristotle gave Alexander the dangerous belief that the world was understandable, and once the world feels understandable, accepting it as it is becomes unbearable. This wasn't arrogance yet, it was alignment. Alexander felt himself fitted for movement, as if stillness were misuse. Even moderation, taught carefully, turned into discipline rather than limitation. Aristotle shaped a mind that could justify ambition without calling it hunger, and that mattered, because ambition with language becomes destiny in its own eyes. Alexander didn't leave his education feeling wise in the peaceful sense. He left feeling incomplete. The world seemed too large to ignore and too fragile to leave untouched. Education didn't give him answers. It gave him dissatisfaction with the present and confidence in his capacity to reshape it. And dissatisfaction, once rooted, doesn't fade. It waits. The first taste of command doesn't arrive with trumpets or ceremony. It arrives quietly, almost unnoticed, like a shift in gravity. One moment you're speaking, the next the room has gone still, eyes fixed on you, waiting. For Alexander, this came far too early, before doubt could harden into caution, before empathy learned how heavy consequences feel. As a teenager, still raw, still unfinished, he discovered something most people never do. When he spoke, people moved. When he decided, men adjusted their stance. When he pointed, others followed. And that realization rewires the mind, because obedience isn't just a reaction, it's a mirror. It reflects back a version of yourself that feels larger, sharper, more solid than the uncertain boy you were days before. Alexander felt it immediately, the thrill of control mixed with pressure, because once people obey you, you don't get to be wrong casually anymore. Every hesitation is noticed, every decision leaves a mark. And yet, for someone raised around power, soaked in ambition, trained to measure himself against giants, this didn't frighten him. It answered something restless inside him, a hunger education had sharpened but never satisfied. Command offered immediacy, thought collapsing into action, intention becoming reality. The first time soldiers responded to him, not to Philip, not to older generals, something clicked. Not joy, not cruelty, but recognition, like finding a key you didn't know you were carrying. Psychologically, this is dangerous because authority rewards decisiveness before wisdom matures. It teaches that speed creates momentum, momentum creates loyalty, and loyalty creates more power, a loop that feeds itself. Obedience simplifies the world, complexity collapses into hierarchy, right and wrong blur into effective and ineffective, and consequences feel distant when they fall on others. Still, Alexander wasn't naive. He had watched his father rule, watched rivals disappear, watched how quickly power turns on weakness, so his authority came with urgency, the need to prove again and again that obedience was justified. Leadership learned under pressure doesn't teach patience, it teaches compression. Act before uncertainty spreads, choose decisiveness over delay. Each time he acted and the world bent, it reinforced a belief that would follow him for life. Movement solves problems, hesitation creates them. And this is the lasting imprint of early command, not arrogance, not cruelty, but acceleration, the mind learning to outrun its own limits. From that first moment people obeyed him, Alexander stopped being merely shaped by power. He became a source of it. And power, once felt this directly, doesn't fade. It becomes habit, identity, expectation, until the world itself feels wrong when it doesn't respond. Philip didn't die in bed, and that matters more than history usually admits, because there was no warning, no sickness, no slow decline that lets a kingdom adjust its breathing. He was killed suddenly, publicly, violently, in the middle of celebration. And in one instant, Macedonia went from confident to exposed. And exposure is the most dangerous condition a state can be in. Because when Philip fell, the system he built didn't collapse, but it wobbled, badly. And Alexander was only 20 years old, 20, not eased into power, not protected by ritual or time, but dropped straight into the vacuum. And history likes to say he ascended the throne, but that word is far too gentle, because he didn't rise into power, he clung to it, he survived it. The court did not unite around him, it evaluated him in silence. Every noble and general asking the same unspoken question, can he hold this? Not does he deserve it, because deserving means nothing when power is fresh and fragile. Philip had ruled through strength and reform, and strength breeds resentment, while reform breeds fear. So his death released tensions that had been waiting quietly, and now they surfaced all at once. Older generals loyal to Philip but untested in their loyalty to his son, rival claimants with bloodlines, Greek cities sensing weakness, Persia noticing the pause. Everyone notices a pause, and Alexander understood immediately that this was not a moment for explanation or fairness, because new power does not survive debate, it survives clarity, and clarity often looks like violence from the outside. He moved before uncertainty could organize, crushed rebellion before it found language, punished dissent before it gained confidence, not from rage, but calculation under pressure. Because hesitation here wasn't mercy, it was invitation. And Alexander learned his first irreversible lesson as king. Authority is not granted by title, it is accepted or resisted. And resistance spreads if it senses softness too early. So he made examples, not speeches. And this is where myth begins to lie, because later stories frame this as destiny or courage, but it wasn't destiny, it was containment. Not ambition yet, but control. Not conquest, but consolidation. And inside all of this, he had lost a father. Dangerous, demanding, complicated, but a father nonetheless. And he showed no public grief, not because he didn't feel it, but because public grief invites challenge, because weakness becomes leverage when power is unsettled. This split began here between inner emotion and outer necessity, and it never fully healed, because the speed of his response shocked everyone, especially those who doubted him. And within months, the message was clear. Philip was gone, but the system he built was intact and sharper. And this crisis shaped Alexander more than any later victory, because this is where he learned that power does not wait for maturity, it tests you immediately, and that effectiveness often looks like cruelty from the outside. That survival sometimes demands actions you will never fully justify. That restraint can be a luxury you cannot afford when authority is new. And by the time stability returned, if it can be called that, Alexander was no longer just Philip's son. He was a force others recalculated around. Because he had done the one thing that mattered most at the beginning of rule. He had held the throne. And once a ruler learns that survival requires speed, decisiveness, and the suppression of doubt, those habits harden. And Philip had left him an army, a vision, an unfinished campaign, but more importantly, a throne that punished weakness instantly. And Alexander did not inherit peace, he inherited momentum. And momentum, once accepted, does not allow stopping, because stopping feels like death. Alexander did not choose war because of prophecy or long-term strategy, and not even because of destiny, the way history likes to frame it. He chose war because standing still was the most dangerous thing he could do, because hesitation after sudden power is interpreted not as caution, but as weakness. And Alexander had learned, violently, quickly, that new authority survives only by movement. The moment Philip died, the throne became unstable, not just politically, but psychologically, because every pause invited calculation, every delay gave rivals time to imagine alternatives, and imagination is where rebellion begins. And Alexander understood this instinctively, not as theory, but as pressure in the chest. The awareness that if he waited, if he consolidated too slowly, if he ruled cautiously, others would decide for him what kind of ruler he was. War offered something immediate and ruthless: direction. Because war collapses complexity into urgency, it forces alignment. It gives soldiers purpose, generals clarity, cities fear, and fear stabilizes faster than loyalty ever does. By moving outward, Alexander prevented forces from turning inward, because an empire looking ahead does not have time to look back. And this is the part history often misunderstands. He did not march because he was reckless. He marched because restraint felt like decay, because stillness felt like suffocation, because momentum was the only thing holding his authority together. Fear played a larger role than ambition here. Not fear of enemies, but fear of pause. fear of being tested before he was ready, fear of being judged by those older, more experienced, more entrenched than him. And war flipped that dynamic, because once armies move, debate ends. And once decisions are made at speed, doubt has no room to organize. Alexander had seen how quickly loyalty shifted in courts, how silence hid calculation, how patience was often just waiting for someone to fail, and he refused to give anyone that space. So war became containment, not conquest yet, a way to lock the system into motion before it could turn on him. Psychologically, this mattered more than territory, because action creates legitimacy faster than inheritance ever does. And every step forward reinforced the same lesson he had already learned as a teenager. Movement solves problems, hesitation multiplies them. This belief hardened here because success followed speed, rebellions collapsed, allies fell in line, fear spread ahead of him, and each confirmation made stopping feel more dangerous than continuing, because stopping meant listening again, negotiating again, explaining again, and explanation is where authority thins. Alexander did not believe war would be easy. He believed delay would be fatal, and that belief shaped everything that followed. Because once a ruler associates motion with survival, peace begins to feel unnatural, almost irresponsible. And so his first campaigns were not about glory or revenge or even Persia yet. They were about proving that power under him moved outward, not inward, that uncertainty would not be allowed to settle, that his reign would not be defined by consolidation, but by acceleration. And this is the quiet truth beneath the legend. Alexander did not choose war because he loved it. He chose it because it prevented something worse: stagnation, doubt, and the slow unraveling of authority. And once war worked, once it stabilized his rule, once it silenced questions, it taught him something irreversible, that forward motion was safety. And from that moment on, stopping no longer felt like rest, it felt like exposure. Crossing into Asia was not strategic so much as a psychological one, because this was the moment where movement stopped being defensive and became something harder to name, something that no longer answered a threat but created its own momentum. Until now, Alexander could tell himself he was stabilizing a kingdom, securing borders, silencing rivals, but the instant his army crossed the Hellespont, that justification thinned. Because Asia was not necessary for survival, it was available, and availability changes the nature of desire. Stepping onto Persian soil carried a weight that went beyond tactics, because it marked the first time Alexander chose expansion without immediate provocation. And psychologically, that matters, because defense has limits while ambition does not. And this crossing felt ceremonial, even if it wasn't staged that way, an unspoken acknowledgement that there would be no clean return to restraint, that whatever happened next would redefine him permanently. History frames this as confidence or destiny, but inside the mind it often feels like acceleration, the sense that stopping now would make everything already done meaningless, because momentum demands continuation, and Alexander had already learned that motion protected him, politically, emotionally, existentially. And Asia represented scale, not just territory, but possibility, a space large enough to absorb ambition without pushing back immediately. Once there, enemies were no longer familiar rivals, but abstractions, cities without personal memory, armies without shared history. And abstraction makes conquest easier because distance dulls consequence. The first victories came quickly, too quickly, and success at speed distorts judgment because it compresses cause and effect, making power feel clean, almost frictionless. And each win confirmed the same dangerous lesson, that forward motion silenced doubt, that fear dissolved when replaced by action, that resistance collapsed before it fully formed. Psychologically, obsession doesn't announce itself. It grows quietly out of repetition, out of the refusal to pause, out of the fear that stopping would invite reflection, and reflection would invite doubt. Alexander did not yet think in terms of endless conquest, but he had crossed a threshold where limitation felt artificial, where the idea of enough had no clear definition, because defense has an endpoint and obsession does not. And this crossing blurred that boundary irreversibly. He was no longer proving he could rule, he was discovering how far movement could take him before anything truly resisted. And that discovery is intoxicating because it transforms the world into a series of next steps rather than a place with edges. Shh, almost whispered. From this moment on, Asia was not just a battlefield, it was a mirror, reflecting back a version of Alexander who no longer measured success by stability, but by continuation. And once continuation becomes the measure, restraint begins to feel like betrayal of purpose. This is where conquest stops being an answer and becomes a question that can never be satisfied. Because the moment Alexander crossed into Asia, he didn't just leave Europe behind, he left behind the psychological safety of limits, and the world ahead of him would never again feel large enough to stop him on its own. Victory came quickly, and that was the problem. Because each battle ended cleanly enough to feel decisive, but never deeply enough to feel final. And Alexander began to notice something unsettling. The moment one enemy collapsed, another appeared farther ahead, larger, richer, more symbolic. Every triumph promised completion, and every triumph failed to deliver it. Because victory solved immediate resistance, but created new momentum, and momentum does not know how to stop. The first great wins against Persia should have satisfied him. Armies shattered, generals defeated, cities opening their gates. But satisfaction never settled. It flickered and vanished, replaced by the sense that stopping now would turn victory into waste, that everything already endured would lose meaning if he paused. Psychologically, this is where success becomes a trap, because repeated winning trains the mind to expect resolution through continuation, not reflection. And Alexander learned, without realizing it, that calm no longer followed achievement, only the next objective did. Each battlefield reinforced the same lesson. Fear disappeared when he moved forward, doubt quieted when action resumed, and silence only arrived when banners were raised somewhere new. Soldiers celebrated, generals praised, poets began shaping legend. But inside him there was tension, not joy, because completion felt abstract, almost fictional, while movement felt real, necessary, alive. Victory also altered scale. Because after defeating forces once thought unbeatable, everything else appeared smaller, less intimidating, more provisional. And the mind adapts quickly to expanded power, recalibrating what counts as enough, until enough no longer exists. This is the psychological danger of uninterrupted success. It erases natural stopping points because nothing external pushes back hard enough to force reflection. And Alexander was surrounded by confirmation at every turn. Loyalty deepened, fear spread ahead of him, resistance thinned before he arrived, and each confirmation made restraint feel irrational. War had become familiar, almost grounding, while peace felt uncertain, unstable, full of questions he didn't want to answer yet. And so victory stopped being a conclusion and became a requirement, something that had to keep happening to justify itself. Because once you learn that winning quiets unease, losing, or even pausing, feels unbearable. Alexander was not chasing glory in these moments, he was chasing coherence, the hope that one more victory would finally align his inner momentum with an external endpoint. but that endpoint kept receding, because conquest answers threats, but not restlessness. And restlessness, once fed by success, grows faster than fear ever did. This is where triumph turns hollow, not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually, as the space between achievement and fulfillment widens, and Alexander began to live inside that gap, carrying forward not because he loved war, but because stopping felt like standing alone with unanswered pressure. Every battle won narrowed his options rather than expanding them, because continuation became the only path that felt psychologically stable. And so victory refused to end, not because enemies remained, but because completion no longer meant peace. It meant exposure, reflection, and the terrifying possibility that all this motion might not resolve what was driving it. Being unstoppable carries a cost that doesn't announce itself loudly, because at first nothing looks wrong. Victories continue, orders are obeyed, the machine keeps moving. But beneath the motion something begins to thin, and Alexander felt it before he fully understood it. Friends who once spoke freely now measured their words. Laughter softened into caution. Admiration replaced honesty. Generals still saluted, still followed, but their eyes changed, less familiar, more alert. Because when a leader never stops, everyone around him begins to wonder where the stopping point is and whether they'll survive it. Trust doesn't shatter all at once, it decays quietly, through small hesitations, through advice softened to avoid displeasure, through silence where disagreement used to live. And Alexander's relentless momentum made disagreement dangerous, because when success never pauses, doubt looks like betrayal. Psychologically, this is the isolation of absolute effectiveness. Because the more unstoppable you appear, the fewer people feel safe being human around you. And soon, you are surrounded not by companions, but by functions, roles, precautions. Friends become liabilities, not because they intend harm, but because closeness invites vulnerability, and vulnerability threatens control. Generals grow nervous not from fear of defeat, but from fear of proximity, because proximity to unchecked power means sharing responsibility without sharing authority, and any mistake, real or imagined, can become fatal. Alexander began to sense this shift, the way conversations shortened, the way praise increased while honesty vanished. And this created a dangerous feedback loop, because when trust erodes, a ruler compensates with certainty, and certainty accelerates decisions, and accelerated decisions widen distance further. Loyalty remained, but it changed shape, no longer grounded in shared experience, but in fear, ambition, and calculation. And loyalty built on those foundations is brittle. This is where being unstoppable reshapes character, not by making one cruel intentionally, but by forcing distance as a survival mechanism, because intimacy slows motion, and Alexander had learned, again and again, that slowing down felt like risk. The cost here was not just loneliness, but distortion, because without trusted resistance, perception bends, feedback narrows, and power begins speaking mostly to itself. Alexander did not wake up one day mistrusting everyone, but he began to rely more on impulse than counsel, more on momentum than deliberation, because counsel had become careful and momentum had always delivered results. This is the quiet rot beneath unstoppable success. Not collapse, not rebellion, but the erosion of shared reality, where others no longer challenge your direction, only adjust to it. And by the time a ruler notices, the distance is already structural, built into how power flows. Friends grow distant, not out of disloyalty, but self-preservation. Generals grow nervous, not from weakness, but awareness. And trust doesn't break, it dissolves, leaving behind a leader who is obeyed absolutely and understood almost not at all, moving forward with fewer anchors than ever, convinced by experience that stopping is dangerous, unaware that isolation is already changing what unstoppable means. Power without limits does not feel like freedom when it arrives. It feels like silence, the strange quiet that settles when resistance disappears, when objections soften, when even disagreement learns to disguise itself as loyalty. And Alexander entered this phase gradually, almost without noticing, because nothing dramatic marked the moment when no stopped reaching him. It simply arrived less often, then not at all. Advisors began framing concerns as suggestions. Generals learned to phrase warnings as affirmations. Friends stopped interrupting his certainty. And this was not because Alexander demanded obedience overtly, but because experience had taught everyone around him that momentum always won, that doubt never stopped him, and that pushing back carried risk. Psychologically, this is the most dangerous form of power because it doesn't feel oppressive. It feels efficient, clean, frictionless. And when friction vanishes, judgment loses its resistance, decisions slide forward unchecked, and self-correction becomes optional rather than necessary. Alexander had once relied on opposition to sharpen him, on challenge to define edges, but now edges blurred, because if no one can say no, even restraint begins to feel like weakness, even reflection feels like delay, and delay had always been punished by his experience. The most dangerous voice to lose was not an advisor's, but his own, because power without limits teaches you to outrun hesitation before it can fully form, to treat doubt as noise rather than signal, and slowly, quietly, self-restraint erodes, replaced by certainty that feels earned because it has been rewarded so often. This is where authority turns inward, where control over others becomes expectation of control over reality itself. Not consciously, not arrogantly, but habitually, because nothing has pushed back hard enough to prove otherwise. Alexander did not believe himself invincible, but he began to believe momentum itself was protective, that motion was safety, that hesitation was exposure. And when even the inner voice that once questioned begins to soften, power stops being something you wield and becomes something that carries you, faster and faster, without pause. This is not tyranny yet, not madness, but drift, the slow separation from proportion, the subtle loss of internal brakes. And by the time a ruler notices that no one is saying no, including himself, limits already feel unnatural, almost unreasonable. And power without limits stops feeling like control and starts feeling like inevitability, a force that must continue because stopping would mean facing how far it has already gone. Identity doesn't fracture all at once. It thins, stretches, blurs, and Alexander began to feel this long before he had language for it, because the world around him no longer reflected a single version of who he was. To Greeks, he was becoming something unfamiliar, dressed differently, ruling differently, adopting customs they whispered about with unease. To Persians, he was not fully foreign, but never fully theirs either, a conqueror who spoke of continuity while embodying rupture. And somewhere inside this widening gap, Alexander himself began to lose the clean outline of identity that once anchored him. Because power at scale does something strange. It forces you to become many things at once, and over time, Those roles stop agreeing with each other. He had been raised Greek, educated in Greek ideals, trained to admire reason, proportion, restraint. Yet now he ruled an empire that required symbolism, ceremony, distance, and divine framing, because vast populations do not follow men, they follow meanings. So Alexander adapted, not out of vanity, but necessity, adopting Persian dress, Persian court rituals, Persian ideas of kingship, and each adaptation solved a political problem while creating a psychological one, because the more he integrated, the less he recognized himself. Some followers saw betrayal, others saw evolution, but Alexander felt something quieter and more dangerous: disorientation, the sense that no single identity fit the scale of what he had become. Gods entered the conversation not because he believed himself divine, but because divinity offered coherence where humanity fractured, a single explanation large enough to contain contradictions. And when people began treating him as more than human, correcting them became impractical, almost counterproductive, because myth stabilized what personality could not. Yet inside, he still felt human, tired, driven, restless, uncertain, and this split between internal experience and external projection widened daily, because the larger the empire grew, the less room there was for a simple self. Alexander stopped asking, "Who am I?" and began asking, "What must I be?" And that shift is where identity erodes, because must replaces is, and adaptation replaces coherence. Greek no longer felt sufficient. Persian never felt complete. God felt useful but hollow, and man felt too small for the weight he carried. And so he lived in between, improvising identity the way he improvised rule, believing movement would resolve what reflection could not. But identity cannot be conquered, only integrated. And Alexander had no time to integrate, because stopping still felt dangerous. And this is where the fracture deepened, not into madness, not yet, but into ambiguity, a leader increasingly unsure whether the face the world saw was a role, a necessity, or the only version of himself left, moving forward without a stable answer to the question that once grounded him, unsure whether he was still becoming something or slowly dissolving into what power required him to be. Expansion did not continue because the empire required it. It continued because stopping had become unbearable, because by this point, movement was no longer a strategy but a refuge, a way to outrun questions that grew louder the moment Alexander stood still. The empire was already vast to administer cleanly, too complex to stabilize fully, and he knew this on some level. Yet knowledge no longer guided him the way momentum did, because momentum had become safety, and safety had become habit. Each step east offered distance, not from enemies, but from reckoning, because pausing would have meant returning to courts filled with tension, generals watching closely, cultures pulling apart, identities colliding, and worst of all, reflection, the quiet space where doubt could finally speak. Psychologically, this is how expansion becomes escape, not as conscious avoidance, but as preference, because forward motion still delivered clarity while consolidation delivered friction, and Alexander had learned which one felt survivable. The farther east he moved, the less anyone could challenge the direction, because the very scale of the campaign justified itself, and magnitude silences criticism more effectively than argument ever could. Soldiers were exhausted, supply lines strained, administration fraying, yet every hardship became another reason not to turn back, because turning back would force meaning onto suffering that continuation conveniently postponed. This is the trap of success without rest. endurance becomes identity, and stopping feels like betrayal of everything already endured. Alexander was no longer chasing territory so much as coherence, the hope that one more horizon would finally align the fractured parts of himself, Greek, king, conqueror, symbol, into something whole. But coherence does not come from distance, and the farther he moved, the more the empire resembled his inner state, immense, impressive, and increasingly difficult to hold together. Expansion dulled the pressure temporarily, replacing internal strain with external urgency. But urgency is addictive, and Alexander learned to rely on it the way others rely on certainty. He did not ignore limits, he outran them, believing motion could substitute for integration. And this belief hardened with every mile, because nothing stopped him decisively enough to prove otherwise. When advisors warned of exhaustion, he heard resistance. When soldiers hesitated, he heard weakness, because his own hesitation had long ago been classified as danger. And so expansion continued, not as vision, but as momentum, not as ambition, but as avoidance, until the direction itself became sacred, and east was no longer a destination, but a necessity, a place far enough away that the empire and the man at its center would not yet have to face what holding it all together would actually require. The end did not arrive in a blaze of glory or a final defining battle. It arrived the way exhaustion always does, quietly, after being ignored for too long. Because Alexander's will had learned how to override limits, but his body had been keeping a separate record, one that did not care about ambition, identity, or momentum. Years of wounds left to scar without rest, fevers dismissed as inconveniences, sleep shortened until it barely counted as recovery, alcohol used not for celebration but for dulling the edge of strain, marches that never truly ended, all of it accumulated invisibly until the body began doing what the mind had refused to do: slow down. There was no dramatic collapse at first, no single moment where strength vanished, just fatigue that lingered longer each morning, pain that no longer faded between campaigns, illness that returned instead of passing. And Alexander responded the only way he knew, by pushing harder, by treating weakness as a challenge to overcome rather than a warning to heed. Psychologically, this was the final consequence of a life built on motion, because admitting exhaustion felt indistinguishable from surrender, and surrender threatened the identity he had forged through endurance, so the body became something to dominate, not listen to. He had endured wounds, storms, mutiny, betrayal, isolation. Why should sickness be different? But sickness does not negotiate. It does not respond to resolve, and it does not care how far you have already gone. The empire still demanded decisions, generals still waited for direction, administrators still leaned on his presence to hold fragile systems together, even as his strength thinned. And Alexander tried to meet all of it through will alone, believing, as he always had, that motion would solve what pause could not. But here, movement offered no relief, only deeper strain, because the body had reached a limit the mind could not acknowledge. And this dissonance between an unstoppable will and a failing body became unbearable. There was no heroic clarity in this phase, no sense of completion or triumph, only frustration, confusion, and the quiet injustice of a body refusing orders for the first time. Exhaustion caught him not in battle, but in stillness, not at the edge of conquest, but at the center of what he had already taken. And that is the cruel truth of it. The will can imagine infinity, but the body enforces finitude, and it does so without ceremony. Alexander had crossed continents, outpaced empires, reshaped the world through relentless motion, but he could not outrun the simplest boundary of all. And when his body finally insisted on stopping, It was not defeat that arrived. It was reality, arriving late, uncompromising, and indifferent to everything his will had built to keep it away.
Alexander's death solved nothing, and that is precisely why it mattered so much. Because when he died, there was no feeling of arrival, no sense that the world had exhaled after years of holding its breath, only confusion, only the sudden realization that the force holding everything together was gone. He did not leave behind a clear successor, not a son old enough to rule, not a brother strong enough to command unquestioned loyalty, not even a written plan that could pretend to replace his will. And so the moment his body failed, the empire did too. Not collapsing in fire and screams, but splintering quietly, almost politely at first. Generals standing around his deathbed not united in grief, but frozen in calculation. Each of them knowing that Alexander had built an empire that only worked when he was present, when his authority silenced rival ambition, when his momentum kept everyone moving forward. Without him, the system revealed what it truly was. Not a state, not a structure, but a shared dependence on a single person. And once that person vanished, uncertainty rushed in to fill the space. No one knew who was supposed to speak first, who had the right to decide, who could say, "This is mine," without being challenged. Because Alexander had never allowed that question to exist while he lived. And that was his final, quiet mistake. The empire lingered just long enough to pretend continuity. Coins struck with his image, decrees issued in his name, but the illusion couldn't hold, because loyalty to a memory is weaker than loyalty to a living threat. And soon the fractures widened. Generals became kings, allies became rivals, borders hardened where movement once flowed freely, and the vast world Alexander had dragged into motion slowed, then stalled, then tore itself apart. There was no closure in his death because his life had been defined by motion without pause, by expansion without consolidation, by will without rest. And death arrived not as a conclusion, but as an interruption. Exhaustion finally catching a body that ambition refused to listen to. History likes endings that explain themselves. Final battles, last speeches, clean successions. But Alexander left none of that behind, only fragments. A body far from home, an empire too large to hold, generals arguing over proximity to his legacy, and a legend already detaching from the human being it came from. His death did not answer the question of who he was or what it all meant. It only exposed the truth that had been there all along, that conquest can reshape the world but cannot stabilize it forever. That power concentrated too tightly breaks apart when released. And that some lives do not resolve into meaning at the end. They simply stop, leaving others to argue over what remains. What Alexander actually left behind was not an empire in the true sense of the word. And that becomes clearer the longer you sit with his story. Because empires are meant to outlive the person who builds them. They are supposed to stabilize, to settle, to turn motion into structure. And nothing Alexander touched ever truly settled. What he left behind instead was a question, persistent, unresolved, almost uncomfortable, that history keeps circling without being able to put down. How much can one person carry before it breaks them? Alexander carried more than territory. He carried expectation, projection, fear, worship, resentment, loyalty, and the constant pressure to become larger than himself. And for a while, an extraordinary, almost frightening while, he succeeded. Because his will was faster than doubt, his energy stronger than fatigue, his momentum greater than resistance, and the world bent around that force. But bending is not the same as holding.
And everything Alexander built depended not on institutions or succession or shared authority, but on his presence, his decisions, his speed, his refusal to stop. He carried contradictions that should have torn anyone apart: Greek and Persian, king and god, rational strategist and restless dreamer, disciplined commander and impulsive youth, human body and mythic expectation. And he held them together through motion, always motion. Cities were founded not to settle, but to mark progress. Battles were won not to end conflict, but to justify the next advance. Cultures were merged not through patience, but through forceful inclusion. From the outside, this looked like vision. From the inside, it was pressure management. Because stopping, even briefly, would have required him to confront what all that movement was covering up: uncertainty, exhaustion, identity fracture, and the terrifying possibility that conquest had become less about purpose and more about escape. When Alexander died, young and far from home, there was no clean collapse, no dramatic ending that tied the story together. There was fragmentation, confusion, generals arguing over pieces they could not truly control, an empire that shattered almost immediately because it had never learned how to exist without him at its center. And that is the quiet truth of his legacy. Alexander did not fail because he wasn't great enough. He failed because he was too central. He carried everything himself, believing, perhaps unconsciously, that releasing weight was the same as losing control. What he left behind were roads that still carried ideas, cities that still bore his name, legends that still inspire awe, but also a warning written between the lines: that greatness achieved without limits extracts a cost that is rarely visible until it's too late. Alexander shows us that power can expand faster than identity, that success can outrun self-understanding, and that a single human mind, no matter how brilliant or driven, has a threshold. His life asks us whether history should admire the one who carried the most, or question why he felt he had to carry it alone. And that question remains unresolved, because every generation feels the pull of his example, and every generation quietly fears the same ending.